So we've got some fairly big nerfs to Lichguard and Doomsday firepower, though some rather nice points decreases to Warriors, the Monolith and the Silent King. Let's talk about the Necrons points and rules updates and the big balance changes for Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons, and in this video I thought we'd talk through how the points and rules changes are likely going to be affecting the faction going forward. As I'm sure basically all of you are pretty well aware at this point, Games Workshop has basically just turned Warhammer 40k on its head, really quite enormous buffs and nerfs to virtually every single faction in the game. Armies like Eldari, Custodians and Genes to the Cult got hit very hard, lots of the weaker factions got enormous buffs, and Necrons found themselves somewhere vaguely towards the top of the pile in Warhammer 40k, and seem to have got themselves a bit of both. In 10th edition, Necron tournament performance hasn't been terrible, around about 51% wins overall, and I think that's fairly impressive in the face of horrors like Eldari, Genes to the Cult, Custodians and Imperial Knights stomping around. Competitive Necron lists maybe did tend to build around just a few key tricks, things like Lichguard blocks backed up by characters and reanimators, then support them with a whole bunch of heavy firepower from Doomsday weapons, Locust destroyers, and perhaps a Transcendent Catan to give the enemy something to chew on. There's definitely a whole bunch of really interesting supporting units beyond that, things to skitter around and get to grips with the enemy or take primary or secondary objectives. For this update, one of the core rules changes definitely seems to have impacted Necrons in the stratagems things, though most of the rest haven't changed too much. The main things are the points changes. It doesn't look like they had any balanced Dataslate changes, like say restricting the Transcendent Catan's Sempiternal Weave or anything. It looks like they literally felt that points would be enough this time round. Broadly speaking, I might expect Necrons to be perhaps a little bit weaker after this update. There's definitely some good stuff as well. I feel like they're probably not going to be in too bad a spot until winter, when of course they've got a codex coming out with a whole bunch of new detachments and probably a bunch of rewritten units and datasheet rules. First up, there was that core rule change that means that devastating wounds no longer splash to other models in the squad. They're no longer mortal wounds, so it basically means that anti-tank weapons with devastating wounds aren't going to be quite as good against hordes and things. I think this was primarily aimed at Eldar with their enormous great big Wraith Cannon type weapons taking out large squads, though a few things have got hit by the Necrons by this. Perhaps the Doomsday Arc with its big damage Doomsday Cannon will be hurt a little bit by that, though it's usually going to prefer to fire at tanks anyway. But otherwise, things like War Scythes, Qatar Melee, and the Monolith's Particle Whip might be toned down a little bit against units with slightly lower wound counts, but a lot of the time it might not matter too much if you're firing at things like Space Marines or above. All the above do have the advantage of being better against armies like Custodians with mortal wound defense now, so there is a bit of a give and take. Otherwise, probably the single most important change is that the free stratagems have been locked to battle tactics now. That's really going to be a blow for overlords that won't be able to use that reactive reanimation stratagem on their charges anymore, or do things like Overwatch with warriors or things. The two battle tactics in Index Necrons are Protocol of the Hungry Void for a +1 strength in melee and extra AP if you're leading the squad, which I guess the overlord would be if he's in there, and then the Conquering Tyrant one for the full reroll wound rolls when you're shooting. I guess the one's relevant for the Lichguard, the other's relevant if he's leading Immortals or Warriors. In the enemy turn, there's less choice now, really. I suppose it could be Go to Ground from the core book, if that's relevant, if you don't already have a Hypermaterial Ablator or something. But overall, this is really quite a bad change for Overlords, who are very popular in things like the Deathless Lichguard bricks, or in Warrior Blobs. I still think they're solid enough, they do bring Resurrection Orbs and okay stat line, and those free stratagems aren't nothing. It definitely is a blow to their utility though. Otherwise, for core rule changes, the Titanic and Towering changes will affect the Monolith, and other things like the Tesseract Vault and the Seraptech Heavy Construct. It's maybe not the end of the world, seeing as the Monolith specifically got a points cut, though it does mean it won't be able to Overwatch anymore, and the Towering change does mean that it won't be able to draw lines of sight quite as easily as before, though it will still have an advantage when nosing into cover. Otherwise, I guess the Insane Bravery change could be relevant for squads prior to reanimation. There might be a few more Necron units that are depleted and have to test before they get to use their reanimation protocols, but I guess it's something that's going to affect really quite a lot of units out there, and not just Necrons. Getting into the points changes properly though, let's talk through Infantry, then Vehicles, then Characters. For the Infantry, perhaps the best news comes from the Necron Warrior Squad, which has dropped down to 110 points for 10 of them rather than 120. Perhaps a little bit surprising, seeing as they were already really quite a good unit in my opinion. Competitively, people did tend to build around Lichguard a little bit more so than Warriors, though I don't think that the Warriors were realistically all that far behind, and now you've got really quite a cheap unit to build around and reanimate if you want to. Kind of good to see them remain strong, and even get more so. They are pretty much the most iconic Necron unit out of any of them, I guess. Otherwise, reasonable points cuts to both the Ophidian Destroyers and the Scorpec Destroyers. Both of them go down to 100 points per 3 rather than 110. I think that seems like quite a sensible change, really. They both just felt a bit on the underwhelming side to me for their points cost before. The Scorpecs just not quite good enough to hold the battle line. The Ophidians, I think, just paying a bit too much for a premium for their movement tricks, not that that's not useful. I think that probably gets them to a bit more in contention with the other stronger Necron units as utility type things, and the Scorpecs also had their Lord go down as well, as we'll mention in a second. Technically, the biggest percentage-wise change came to the Triarch Praetorians, which are now 120 per 5 rather than 135. That's down 11%, but I still think that despite that, they're not really that outstanding. They don't have that good character support, and while their jump packs are helpful, I feel like it's still not quite enough to really get them there. If you do want to use them though, it's definitely a step in the right direction. Otherwise though, Lichguard got a very heavy points increase. They went up from 95 points to 115. While that is really quite a big percentage swing, I still feel like it's not the end of the world for them. The amount of support they get did make them basically auto-include in previous Necron competitive lists, and despite a few of the elements of that combo being a little bit nerfed, I think that there's still enough stacking goodness that you can get on a unit of Lichguard to justify them. If you wanted to replace some of them with Warriors though, or Immortals, there'd be a bit more of a debate though between the units. Finally for Infantry, the Locust Heavy Destroyers have gone up from 45 to 50. Sounds like quite a small points change, but that's actually quite a bit percentage-wise again. I think they're still very usable, and both of their guns, the anti-infantry and the anti-tank one, remain fine. It's definitely going to feel a little bit more painful when you lose one though, they aren't really all that tough. Getting on to vehicle and Canoptech units next, and the biggest wins come from the Monolith and the Tesseract Vault. The Monolith drops down to 350 points from 385, and the Tesseract Vault to 375 from 425. I'm perhaps slightly surprised at just how well the Monolith has done for itself. Again, I felt that was probably in the region like the Warriors, where it was really quite usable. Maybe a little bit predictable with just hovering up the board and blasting things with the death rays, but it also does give you some interesting options like being able to zap infantry over to it. It isn't actually all that bad in melee either with its Portal of Exile against the right targets. I'd say that the points change far outweighs the more towering nerfs that it's changed, and it is looking like quite a good unit going forward, I feel. The Tesseract Vault got a slightly bigger percentage decrease, though I still don't think it really quite catches it up with the Monolith, I'm afraid. It is kind of funny that as ever the Obelisk is overlooked in this, the really tanky defensive one that still pays a similar sort of price, but just doesn't really do any meaningful damage. On the flip side, the nerfs came to the Doomsday Arc, which is a slightly painful one. That's 210 points up from 185. I can perhaps see why they did it, as they were really quite commonly run in competitive lists, though I feel like that's maybe a tiny bit more than I might have gone for myself. 210 points really takes the shine off them, even if they do have big hitting anti-tank guns. The Doomstalker doesn't go up by quite as much proportionally, and I feel like the two are probably going to be a bit more balanced now. I would have rated the Arc as a little bit ahead before, now maybe they're a little bit more balanced due to the relative percentage increases. And the Canoptech Reanimator's gone up from 95 to 105. I don't think that's usually going to change anything for most people. Literally just an extra 10 points for multiple reanimations is going to be well worth it in most lists, I feel. Finally, for characters and things, I think it's probably worth making special note of the Transcendent Catan. Games Workshop seems to be pretty decided that he can take the Sempiternal Weave. So basically, if you're taking one of these, he essentially costs 310 points now, as you're always going to take that. A 4+ Feel No Pain and essentially double durability for this kind of model for 10 points is just so stupidly auto-include that you'd be very silly not to. For some reason they've decided to instead increase the base model for the Transcendent Catan, which does kind of feel like just punishing people for taking that if they're not taking the upgrade. Feels like an odd way of doing things, but I feel like at 300 points that still makes him very, very good for the cost. His damage output is definitely not spectacular for that kind of thing, but the fact that he just shrugs off so much damage and then just reanimates is still going to make him a bit of a nightmare to deal with enemies, can tie up units and gradually chip away with him with his okay melee. Jumping around the board can be quite fun as well, even if it does keep him out of combat for a turn. Finally though, for the other character units, there's more buffs than there are nerfs. I think a crowd pleaser for the Necrons is going to be the Silent King going down to 420 from 470. He'd basically gone from being very good throughout quite a lot of 9th edition to really quite underwhelming with the buffs that he gives. I think for 420 he's a lot more credible, though it's still really quite a big section of a list. I'm still a bit unconvinced if he's actually going to break through to be taken competitively by many people. I feel like maybe if you want a great big centerpiece, then things like that Transcendent Catan or the Monolith are still probably going to steal his thunder a bit, but the gap's definitely a bit closer than it was at least with the Catan. Otherwise, perhaps one of the very biggest winners of the index is Illuminor Seraz, dropping down from 220 to 185, a fairly monstrous stat line and genuinely amazing buffs to Necron Battle Line units. Particularly with the warrior decrease, I feel like we could definitely see him running around supporting squads of those. Seems strange that he gets a buff when so many of the other Necron characters basically remain untouched. He was already kind of usable already, I thought, even if he did have to build around him a bit. Otherwise, the Scorpet Lord goes down considerably, 115 to just 100 points. That's a big drop of about 35 points if you're using him with a squad of 6 Scorpex. Not too bad for a fairly scary frontline threat, I suppose. The Locust Lord drops a little bit from 85 down to 80, just a little bit more efficiency with either squad of destroyers, and Imhotep the Stormlord goes down from 105 to 100. I kind of wonder whether he might be going down a bit and having his points messed around with because there's the rumours of the new model coming for him in the next Necron Codex. In any case, I feel like some people might be a little bit more tempted by him now the Overlord stratagems are a bit more restricted. He still doesn't really do enormous amounts for you besides regenerate CP though, and a bit of his own combat threat. Finally, for character nerfs, the single harshest nerf in the entire index goes to the Cryptothralls, going from 40 points, and it auto includes in tough Necron Warrior and Lichguard blocks to 60 points. A huge 50% points increase, and I feel like for most people that's probably going to flip them from being auto takes to never takes, though I still think you could probably just about get enough value out of them if you reanimated them multiple times, maybe in a Necron Warrior block more so than Lichguard perhaps now. Realistically, these guys are now going to be paying a premium if you want an extra big and durable unit that can reanimate even further. Still might be usable if you absolutely want to build a Necron castle to the sky, though definitely far less auto-include. Finally, the Hexmark Destroyer with its 6-pistol gunslinging, that one goes up to 80 points from 70. A medium scale points increase now, but I still think that it's probably going to be worth it to have one of those hang around a super durable Necron Warrior or Lichguard block. It just can cause the opponents a lot of problems if they try and approach the unit with any sort of infantry and still want to shoot it. Otherwise though, not really too harsh on the character nerfs for the Necrons. All the excellent crypt texts that add amazing value for their cost are all left untouched, though no changes to the Overlord to reflect his diminished stratagem command abilities. A few other things were passed over, like Trazyn the Infinite as well. Overall, I feel like this hasn't been the worst update for the Necrons in the world. 4 biggest winners of the changes, I'd say Warriors have done pretty great going down to 11 points and being really nice. Monoliths are going to be better than ever to put on the table. The Silent King's seen a big 50-point decrease, and Illuminor Seraz is looking very tempting alongside Warrior blocks. For the biggest nerfs and losers, I'd say Lichguard have lost a lot of ground compared with Warriors, though I still think they could be worth building around. I don't think they're a wrong choice. Overlords are definitely much worse, and then Cryptothralls and Doomsday Arcs are probably some of the biggest other losers, bar the things that Games Workshop just didn't really feel like fixing, things like the Doom Scythe, the Convergence of Dominion, Obelisks, and perhaps the Psychomancer. I feel like all of those could have been good candidates for points decreases. Overall, with all the changes, I'd say it probably amounts to a small nerf, though not a huge one. You're still going to be able to build some very tanky durability bricks, particularly with Warriors, though perhaps the supporting firepower for them will go down a little bit. Between the Locust Heavies, the Doomsday Arc and the Doomstalker all going up, it just puts them on a bit more level with the other Necron fire support weapons, I feel. Let me know your thoughts on the changes though, how will this affect your Necrons list going forward, and how sensible do you feel the changes were for the Necrons as a faction overall. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every single day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons are what allow me to keep on making quite so many videos like this, so if you are enjoying it regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.